Neighbor from hell tries to steal our house. Ends up with a $200,000 bill. Before diving in, let's introduce the main players in this saga. Our entitled neighbor will be called Karen going forward. Her spoiled son will be referred to as Jason. Additionally, there's the previous owner of our house, who we'll call Tom. While Tom has a relatively small part in this story, he's important for setting things in motion. Keep in mind that this story spans almost 15 years. Unless stated otherwise, you can assume there were significant gaps between events. Karen owned a large piece of property near a popular recreational lake. I say near, but her property was actually a good distance from the lake. However, the road she lived on was the only one leading to several lakefront properties, resorts, and the most popular boat dock on this side of the lake. Because of that, while some properties in the area were affordable, others were quite valuable, with wealthy people driving by regularly. This detail will matter later. Being relatively wealthy, Karen eventually divided her large property into 4 equal sections when her children became adults. One section went to her daughter, who, shockingly, turned out to be a decent person despite the rest of the family. Another section went to Jason, the spoiled son. Karen built houses on both properties tailored to her children's specifications. The 4th section, the one without Karen's own house on it, was used to build a small convenience store. Keep this store in mind, it's important later. Now, Karen didn't just give her children houses, she handed them the property deeds too. Whether this was to avoid future disputes or for some other reason, it set the stage for the chaos that followed. While Karen's daughter was a responsible and respectable person, Jason was the polar opposite. He was a notorious party animal, and everyone in the neighborhood hated him. His late-night parties were loud and obnoxious, keeping everyone awake. The police were called on him so often that they practically had someone stationed nearby. Karen only made things worse by enabling Jason's behavior. She paid all his bills, water, electricity, garbage, everything. The only thing in Jason's name was the property tax, which he conveniently ignored. Whether Karen assumed Jason was paying it or simply didn't think about it, the consequences were inevitable. One day, the police showed up at Jason's house. He didn't return, and the house went up for auction. The property was in shambles. There were holes in the drywall and even a massive hole in the living room floor leading into the garage. The kitchen floor and subfloor had to be completely replaced, and the walls were covered in grime. His irresponsibility had rendered the house unlivable, according to the bank. Because of this, the only people who could afford it were those able to pay out of pocket. This is where Tom comes in. Tom was a retired hobbyist house flipper, not one of those big-time investors you see on TV. He'd buy cheap auction properties, fix them up himself, and sell them. It wasn't a high-profit operation. It was more about keeping busy during retirement. Tom would live off the profit from his previous flip while working on the next house, putting any leftovers into a modest savings fund. Around this time, my partner and I were in the market for a home. We didn't have a huge budget, but when we saw this house listed online, it seemed perfect. Just the right size, in a great neighborhood, and close to the lake we loved for fishing and boating. The listing didn't include a price, but we decided to check it out. When we drove by, we saw Tom working on the house. We stopped to introduce ourselves and asked about the price. Tom explained that he was planning to fix up the house before putting it on the market. The listing was just a placeholder to streamline the sale later. We chatted for a while and he appreciated the company. We told him we'd be interested in buying the house as is for a reasonable price. He turned us down, saying he already had several offers and wanted to finish the renovations before selling. We thanked him and left our number, asking him to call if he ever changed his mind. Less than 2 weeks later, Tom called unexpectedly. His sister had fallen ill in another state, and he needed to be with her. He didn't have the time or patience to finish the house and offered to sell it to us as is for a fair price. We were thrilled and immediately started looking for a bank willing to loan us the money. A realtor friend helped us find a bank, but there were conditions. We had 2 weeks to bring the house up to code or the loan would default and the bank could auction it off. We explained the situation to Tom, and he generously offered to help as much as he could. Tom wasn't able to do any more work on the house due to the sudden urgency of leaving, but he explained exactly what needed to be done to bring it up to code. He gave us a detailed breakdown of the time, effort, and cost required to meet the minimum standards. Tom even helped us out in another way. We took out a loan for twice the amount he wanted for the house, and he returned the extra half to us so we could use it for repairs. Thanks to Tom's efforts, the house was already close to meeting code. While we could have likely handled it ourselves, we decided to call in a few friends to speed up the process. Together, we got everything done in half the time. Once the house was officially brought up to code, there was still a lot of work left. Over the next several months, we replaced flooring and subflooring, rewired parts of the house, patched countless holes in the walls, and removed old, decaying wallpaper that had been glued directly to the drywall. The place needed an overhaul, but we were determined to turn it into our dream home. Finally, it was time to move in. The house still had a few minor issues that we planned to address as we settled in, but it was livable. We were beyond excited to start this new chapter of our lives. However, we weren't even finished moving in when Karen, the infamous neighbor Tom had warned us about, decided to introduce herself. Tom had repeatedly cautioned us about Karen's entitled attitude, but at first, she seemed perfectly nice. She stopped by, introduced herself warmly, and we had a pleasant conversation. For a moment, we wondered if Tom had been exaggerating. But then it happened. As we were wrapping up our chat, Karen's tone shifted. She kindly and compassionately informed us that our house actually belonged to her, and that we had 30 days to vacate. She said she felt sorry for us because we had been scammed into buying her property. According to her, Tom had no right to sell the house, and we were living there illegally. We were horrified. We'd heard horror stories about people being scammed into buying properties that weren't legally for sale, and for a moment we thought we might be one of them. We thanked Karen for explaining the situation and assured her we'd get to the bottom of it. The first thing we did was contact the bank, which confirmed that Tom was the legitimate owner of the deed when we purchased the property. We then spoke with the realtor, who told us the same thing. Finally, we went to Tom, who explained that Karen had accused him of stealing the house multiple times after he bought it at auction. He told us how she had harassed him constantly, claiming the property was hers. We even went to the courthouse to verify that the deed was in our name. Every source we checked confirmed the same story. We were the rightful owners of the house. During this process, several neighbors shared stories about Jason's behavior and how his negligence had led to the property being lost in the first place. Karen returned not long after and asked when we'd be moving out. We calmly explained that we weren't going anywhere. We apologized for her loss and acknowledged how difficult it must have been to lose her family's property due to Jason's irresponsibility, but it wasn't our fault. We weren't going to hand over the home we had purchased with our hard-earned money and spent months fixing up. That's when Karen launched into a long sob story. She claimed the property had been in her family for generations and accused Tom of stealing it during the chaos of Jason's arrest. We asked her why they hadn't bid on the house at auction if it meant so much to her. After all, we had purchased it from Tom for $50,000, well below its market value. She admitted they had refused to bid because they believed the house rightfully belonged to them and didn't think they should have to pay for it. Despite Karen's entitled attitude, we were sympathetic to her situation. We offered to sell the house back to her for $100,000, which was still just over half of its total market value. After buying the house for $50,000 and putting in an additional $30,000 for materials, plus countless hours of labor, we felt this was more than fair. We didn't mention it, but we were even willing to negotiate down to $90,000 if needed. Karen, however, countered with an absurd offer of $40,000. She argued that she shouldn't have to pay anything for a property that rightfully belonged to her, but was willing to be nice and add an extra $10,000 to cover the materials we had used for repairs. When we explained that $50,000 was what we had paid Tom for the house, she accused us of being liars and thieves. She claimed the house was in such terrible condition when we bought it that there was no way. Karen's entitlement reached a breaking point. Not only did she resort to name-calling, but she also had the audacity to call our dream home a dump. This after all the blood, sweat, tears, and money we'd poured into it. That was the final straw. We were done with her nonsense and politely but firmly told her to leave. We made it clear that she was no longer welcome on our property, and that we wouldn't sell her the house even if she offered double its market value. Karen, of course, didn't take this well. She hurled insults at us as she stormed out the door. Later, we found out she was spreading rumors about us all over the neighborhood, accusing us of stealing her house and other baseless claims. At first, we ignored it, thinking no one would actually believe her. But then things escalated. One day, a man we'd never met pulled into our driveway with a gun. He demanded that we leave the house immediately. We'd heard of this man before. He considered himself the peacekeeper of the neighborhood, stepping in to resolve conflicts. Many of the locals actually liked him, saying he was reasonable and did more to maintain peace than the police. In our rural town, where some residents preferred to live off the grid, people appreciated having someone like him around. Our neighborhood was divided into two main sections. The area closer to us was peaceful, populated mostly by retirees who got along well. The other section, deeper into the woods and farmland, was home to folks who didn't always follow the law. We lived right on the edge of the peaceful part, separated by about a mile of woodland. Given his reputation and the descriptions we'd heard, we figured this man was the same peacekeeper. To test our theory, we decided to de-escalate. We invited him in for a beer and a chat, letting him know he could bring his gun if it made him feel safer, but that we'd be bringing ours too. In our town, where gun stores outnumber dollar stores, it wasn't unusual to have a gun on hand. For us, it was a way to say, we can handle ourselves if things go sideways. Thankfully, he didn't point his gun at us, which would have been a whole different story. Over the course of a few hours, we explained the situation. He listened intently, and eventually he apologized. He admitted he'd gotten caught up in the rumors and overreacted, but promised it wouldn't happen again. As we talked, he even thanked us for buying the house. He explained that when Jason moved out, the entire neighborhood breathed a sigh of relief. There were no more complaints about loud music or drunken teenagers stumbling into the road at night. We all had a good laugh about it, and he left without another word. Here's where things start to tie together. Karen's store, built on a section of her original property, had become extremely popular in the neighborhood. Its central location made it convenient for everyone nearby, especially since it was the only store for miles. While the prices were high and the customer service was minimal, people loved the store simply because it saved them a long drive to town. Even we shopped there occasionally despite our differences with Karen. It was just too close and convenient to ignore. Karen's store gave her a strong reputation in the neighborhood. Back then, people believed she and her family were decent folks, so when Karen began spreading rumors about us, people listened. The wildest claim, that we had stolen her house, was too ridiculous for anyone to take seriously. But smaller, pettier rumors gained traction. While no one outright harassed us, the whispers and avoidance were enough to make us feel like outsiders. Some neighbors, not wanting to get on Karen's bad side and risk being banned from the store, kept their distance. They ignored us and left us to fend for ourselves. For years, we dealt with the isolation quietly. After a few years, Jason was released from prison. With nowhere else to go, Karen let him move back into the neighborhood. She wasn't keen on him living in her house, so she rented him an apartment above her convenience store. Karen set strict ground rules. No wild parties on her property, ever. Jason didn't even have to pay rent. His only responsibility was to run the store when Karen was busy, which wasn't often. Unfortunately, Jason hadn't learned his lesson. While working the register, he developed a habit of double-charging customers and pocketing the extra cash. We noticed this on several occasions and went back for refunds. Karen and Jason always claimed the register was broken, but the pattern became too obvious to ignore. Eventually, we brought this to Karen's attention, letting her know Jason was likely stealing from her customers. Even though Karen had an entitled streak, she had never crossed into blatantly illegal behavior. We liked the store and didn't want to see it suffer, so we thought we were doing her a favor. Instead of thanking us, Karen dismissed our concerns, accusing us of imagining things. In her own passive-aggressive way, she told us to mind our own business. So we complied. After Karen brushed us off, we decided to share what we'd seen with a few neighbors. By this point, we had finally made some friends in the neighborhood. It had taken years to gain their trust after Karen's initial smear campaign against us, but small gestures like delivering Christmas treats had gradually broken the ice. Some neighbors thanked us for the warning, though many didn't believe us. Still, word spread quickly. Before long, Mr. Peacekeeper showed up in our driveway again. This time his tone was much friendlier. By now we had built a decent rapport with him. He'd occasionally stop by for a beer and chat about neighborhood happenings. Despite this, he wasn't happy about the rumors circulating about Karen and her store. Mr. Peacekeeper explained that he'd spoken with Karen, who insisted the double charging was a misunderstanding caused by register issues. He warned us to stop spreading rumors if we didn't want any trouble. We wanted to show him proof but knew he wouldn't believe us. He trusted Karen and was more inclined to take her word over ours. Reluctantly, we apologized for the misunderstanding, explaining that we just wanted to protect our friends in the neighborhood. He accepted our apology, gave us a final warning, and left. After that, we decided to avoid shopping at Karen's store unless absolutely necessary. Despite Mr. Peacekeeper's efforts to defend Karen, the damage had already been done. People in the neighborhood started paying closer attention to their receipts after shopping at the store. Over time, they began noticing the same patterns we had. It became clear that Jason was pocketing significant amounts of money, and Karen, aware of what was happening, chose to stay silent. Instead of addressing the issue, she tried to silence complaints with more rumors. Small country stores like Karen's depend heavily on regular customers from the local community. During the summer, vacationers and seasonal residents brought in substantial profits, but this wasn't enough to sustain the store through the winter. That's when everything fell apart. One day, Mr. Peacekeeper finally connected the dots. His anger was loud enough for us to hear next door as he cursed out Jason and Karen in their store. It was a moment of pure satisfaction. But he didn't stop there. Fueled by rage, Mr. Peacekeeper went door to door throughout the neighborhood, exposing their scheme. He even brought a stack of receipts to show anyone who needed proof. Mr. Peacekeeper was one of the most trusted figures in the neighborhood, even more so than Karen. Within 24 hours, he had completely destroyed their reputation. Nearly every local stopped shopping at their store. While Karen and Jason managed to stay afloat during the summer months thanks to vacationers and newcomers, the winter brought disaster. Without the steady income from local customers, they began hemorrhaging money. After 2 brutal winters, they were forced to close the store during the off-season. This meant throwing away more than 90% of their stock every fall and restocking entirely when they reopened in the spring. It was an unsustainable cycle that only worsened their financial troubles. After a few more years, Karen permanently closed her convenience store. Each spring, she and Jason restocked the shelves, only to throw out most of the stock in the fall when they couldn't afford to stay open during the winter. The cycle was clearly unsustainable, and after 3 more years they gave up. The store's closure marked the beginning of Karen's decline in the neighborhood. As her reputation tanked, people began respecting us more. Slowly but surely, we were able to make friends without having to put in so much extra effort. Neighbors stopped treating us like outcasts, and for the first time we felt like we were part of the community. But Karen's troubles were far from over. To get to the climax of this story, I need to give you a bit more background. Apologies if this feels like a small book by now. Karen was extraordinarily nosy. Every time we stepped outside, she'd find an excuse to be out there too. Walking her dog, pulling weeds, or just pretending to check her mail. She would stand by her window and watch our every move. While we didn't have anything to hide, it was unsettling. We weren't on the best terms with her, and having her constantly stare at us wasn't ideal. We planned to install a small pool and hot tub in our backyard and wanted some privacy. So we decided to build a privacy fence. Trying to be neighborly, we informed Karen of our plans. Predictably, she rejected the idea outright. Nevertheless, we told her the fence was happening, but we offered to collaborate on the details such as color and style to ensure it wasn't an eyesore. Our goal was to avoid any disputes. To make things even smoother, we planned to build the fence 1 foot inside our property line. We didn't want Karen to claim it was on her property or cause any drama. While preparing for the fence, we went to the courthouse to obtain a copy of our deed and a map of the property lines. To our surprise, we discovered that Karen was encroaching on about 1/3 of our property. She had built a small shed and planted a garden on our land. The confusion stemmed from the property's unique layout. Instead of a typical rectangular lot, our property lines formed a trapezoid. A line of trees cut through part of the land, creating a triangle-shaped section that Karen was claiming as her own. When we confronted her, she exploded. She called us liars and thieves, throwing out every insult she could think of. We didn't want to escalate things, so we offered a solution. Either she could buy the disputed section of land, or we could trade it for a small portion of her property that connected to ours. The trade would have been mutually beneficial, as the area we requested was inconvenient for her to maintain, and would have made our property more functional. Karen flatly refused. She insisted the land was already hers, and said she wouldn't pay for something that belonged to her. She also refused to trade, accusing us of trying to steal more of her property. This led to a heated and ongoing property dispute. Where we live, property lines aren't always straightforward. Many deeds in our rural area are hundreds of years old, relying on landmarks like trees, rocks, or streams that may no longer exist. Disputes are common, and even small pieces of land can be worth significant amounts of money in certain circumstances. Because of this, our state has strict laws governing property disputes and land surveys. Surveyors must be precise, as even a minor error can result in severe consequences. A surveyor found guilty of an inaccurate survey, whether intentional or accidental, faces hefty fines, loss of their license, and permanent disqualification from practicing in the state. Additionally, they must notify and refund all their clients from the past 10 years and pay for a new survey conducted by an independent surveyor. Thankfully, our property lines were clear since Karen herself had divided the land relatively recently. But that didn't stop her from trying to dispute them. The strict laws worked in our favor, ensuring that Karen couldn't manipulate the situation without risking severe consequences. This high-stakes environment means surveyors avoid property disputes like the plague. Even finding someone willing to take on a survey can be a challenge, let alone affording their steep fees. Unfortunately, Karen managed to hire a surveyor who somehow aligned the property lines exactly as she described. Well, almost. One amusing twist was that the surveyor's report indicated our property stretched to within a foot of Karen's house, a detail she clearly hadn't expected. Despite that small hiccup, Karen's actions left us in a bind. Every time we found a new surveyor, Karen would introduce herself and subtly hint that a property dispute was involved. This would scare off the surveyors, who were unwilling to risk their careers. To make matters worse, the original property markers placed by the bank surveyor when we bought the house mysteriously disappeared before we moved in. Wonder how that happened? We'll probably never know. Hiring a new surveyor would likely cost as much as the disputed land itself, or more. And so we started saving up to hire someone, despite the absurdly high quotes. This brings us to the climax of the story, which happened just a few months ago. A few months back, a severe storm hit the area, knocking down a tree on the disputed property. The tree fell onto our neighbor's land across the street, causing significant damage. It also totaled a brand new sports car driving down the road at the time. Thankfully, no one was hurt, but the cleanup took days. Then came the kicker. We received a bill in the mail for over $200,000. This amount was more than our entire property was worth, even after all the repairs we'd done. The bill came from the insurance company of the car's owner, demanding payment for the damages. For those unfamiliar, property insurance doesn't usually cover damages to someone else's property. That responsibility falls on the property owner if the damage could have reasonably been prevented, for example, by cutting down a risky tree before a storm. The insurance company claimed we were responsible for the damages. We called them immediately, explaining that the tree wasn't on our property. They said they'd investigate and get back to us. A week later, we received another letter. This time it included a deed and a property line map with the fallen tree circled in red. According to their records, the tree was clearly on our property. The letter demanded full payment within 30 days of the initial notice, or else they would take us to court. With about 2 weeks left to respond, we called the insurance company again. We explained yet again that the tree wasn't ours. The agent wasn't convinced. In much nicer words than I'll use here, they essentially called us liars, stating that no one could possibly believe the tree wasn't on our property. Then we gave them the name and contact information of Karen's surveyor. The agent sighed and said they'd investigate further, but reiterated the deadline for payment if we couldn't prove our case. We never heard back from the insurance company. Remember the consequences for providing false survey results? Even if Karen's surveyor admitted to taking a bribe, there was no way they'd risk losing their career and livelihood. They'd likely have to leave the country if the truth came out. Facing such dire consequences, the surveyor wasn't about to provide conflicting information to the insurance company. And so, the matter quietly resolved itself, for us at least. Karen's surveyor's misdeeds had come back to bite them. After a few days, we called the insurance company again to follow up on the issue. The agent seemed almost pleased as they read through their notes. While they couldn't share much due to confidentiality, they did tell us that Karen had disputed the claim, just like we did, insisting the tree wasn't on her property. However, since Karen's surveyor confirmed the property lines and we hadn't officially disputed the survey, the insurance company determined there was no reason to believe the results were false. With no other evidence to go on, the insurance company held Karen fully responsible for the damages caused by the fallen tree. The agent couldn't say more than that, but it was enough for us to feel satisfied. As you might expect, Karen wasn't thrilled about having to pay over $200,000 to the insurance company. While we don't know exactly how much money she had saved, it seemed like enough to cover the bill without selling any of her land. Since then, we've stayed mostly quiet about the ongoing property dispute, though we're still considering saving up for a surveyor to reclaim the land. At this point, it's less about the land itself and more about the principle of the matter. Karen, on the other hand, clearly hasn't let it go. Whenever she looks at us, it's obvious she isn't happy. The funniest part? She acts like we've wronged her, even though we essentially gave her free land. How do you complain about free land? We can't help but laugh at the absurdity. Karen's reputation is in tatters, especially after the neighborhood learned about Jason's thefts. No one trusts her anymore, and she's stuck between a rock and a hard place. We're just sitting back, watching the mess she created consume her. It's a bit like poetic justice. While we were planning our privacy fence, we decided to install an invisible dog fence in the meantime. For those unfamiliar, an invisible dog fence is a buried electrical wire paired with a special collar. When the dog approaches the boundary, the collar emits a beep. If they continue, it delivers a mild shock. Not enough to hurt, just enough to deter them. We tested it ourselves first to make sure it wasn't harmful. It gave a light tingle but didn't hurt. Ideally, the dogs would only hear the beep and avoid the boundary altogether. We installed the fence well inside our property, partly because it wasn't very long and partly to keep the dogs far from Karen's claimed land. Of course, Karen assumed the markers for the invisible fence were for our future privacy fence. In her pettiness, she decided to run over them with her lawn mower. Unfortunately for her, electric lawn mowers and electrified wires don't mix. The mower was completely fried. Every electrical component was ruined, and she had to buy a new one. The best part? Since the wire was well within our property, she couldn't blame us. She didn't even try to accuse us or ask us to replace her mower. I guess she knew exactly how we'd respond. Watching Karen's petty behavior backfire on her has been incredibly satisfying. We've made good friends in the neighborhood, and any rumors Karen tries to spread about us don't stick. At this point, we're just enjoying the peace and watching her burn the bridges she built herself.